So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was the product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world. So now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be about furthering the national interest of the United States, and doing so to the extent possible, avoiding war and armed conflict.
A few days after coming into office, Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, said the world was becoming multipolar again. It was an admission that many people felt was a long-belated recognition of a new reality in the world of more evenly distributed power, the end of the unipolar moment. And now, a few days after that apparent admission of a changed world, the Munich Security Conference has published a report called Multipolarization. Are the great powers of the world coming to terms with the reality of a changed multipolar world? That's the question I'm asking today on the Burning Archive by looking a little bit more closely at this new report by the Munich Security Conference, the Munich Security Report 2025, Multipolarization. Now, I don't think multipolarization is a word that is really going to take off, but it is a word that is coming to terms with the whole idea that the history of the world as being multipolar is being reborn, and that's what we're looking at today on the Burning Archive. And I'm going to look at the report, look at what it says about the multipolar world and the debate it openly engages in about whether or not the world is really multipolar. Perceptions of power, perceptions of risk in the world, and the idea that they introduce about depolarization. But first of all, I should say a little bit about this report. Now, the Munich Security Conference is a major annual get-together of primarily the NATO countries in Munich that discusses security issues. And of course, in recent years, it's been dominated by the issues in Ukraine. And every year it produces a background report for the discussion where people survey some leading researchers survey international opinion about security risks and so forth. The background of the discussion this year was the incoming Trump administration and the statement by Marco Rubio in an interview with Megyn Kelly that eventually you were going to reach back to where you had a multipolar world. It was part of a broader discussion of saying that US foreign policy should focus on its national interest solely and fully. And that he said there, to put the statement in broader context, I think that what was lost at the end of the Cold War, because we were the only power in the world, and so we assumed this responsibility of sort of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. And there are terrible things happening in the world, and he carries on. But it's not normal for the world simply to have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, great powers in different parts of the world. Now, many people have read this statement and attributed a lot of significance to it as a turnaround, I guess, in US foreign policy. I'm a little bit more skeptical of what he has to say there. I think he's saying that the United States doesn't want to take global policeman responsibilities, but it still really wants to be the dominant power in the world. But it is a very interesting comment in the context of this new report by the Munich Security Conference, Multipolarization, the Munich Security Report 2025. It's been prepared by them by Tobias Bunder, Sophie Eisentraut, and Leonid Schuerter. And they have a range of different affiliations. Sophie Eisentraut is, in fact, works for the Munich Security Conference as their lead of research, and Tobias Bunder is a sort of specialist in sort of nuclear strategy, whatever that is, in at the Hertie School of Government, which is like the Kennedy School of Government in the United States. And it's a pretty significant report, and I think quite an interesting one in the context. Perhaps it's not so surprising that Marco Rubio should refer to multipolarization. He would have surely been aware that this report was going to be the sort of major thematic background to the Munich Security Conference when he did have his interview with Megyn Kelly. And it's interesting to look in a little bit more detail about the kind of arguments that are presented in this report to assess the extent to which, the United States is really moving to a multipolar world, or whether it's repositioning itself in rhetorically, if you like, in a new sort of power balance in the world. So let's have a little bit of a look then at what the content of the report is. So it discusses the multipolarization. It has a whole thing of the Munich Security Index, which is the sort of perceptions of risk and also different powers in the world. And then it goes through the United States, China, European Union, Russia, India, Japan, Brazil, and South Africa. So that's 8 states or transnational states, I guess, if you include the European Union. More countries overall, because there's 30-odd countries in the European Union that are covered. And you can see each of these states is giving a cute name, which perhaps, helps... like modified status. And of course, Russia, there's a reference to the Russian Tsar. And Brazil is rather perhaps somewhat insultingly referred to as Lula land. So there's a certain tone type issues I think perhaps the report could perhaps deal with. So it looks at each of these 8 countries and gives, I think, quite an interesting profile. But I really want to focus more on the broad, big picture story that it tells. And in its executive summary, it says this: it has become a truism of foreign policy debates that the world is becoming ever more multipolar. And any viewer of geopolitics channels on YouTube would be familiar with this. While the extent to which today's world is already multipolar is debatable, the world's multipolarization is a fact. Quite how an abstract concept can be a fact, I'm not 100% sure. On the one hand, power is shifting toward a larger number of actors who have the ability to influence key global issues. I think that is the fact, rather than their new invented term of multipolarization. On the other hand, the world is experiencing increasing polarization both between and within many states, which is hampering joint approaches to global crises and threats. The report, I think, should be welcomed in a way, because it is acknowledging that changed distribution of power around the world, even if it sort of muddies the water with its odd concept of multipolarization. And it is good to see this big, powerful gathering accepting this real reality of a different distribution around the world. It largely frames the debate as the sort of pros and cons of a multipolar world, the people who see the promise and the people who see the perils of a multipolar world. And that is really where it brings in this idea of depolarization. So it doesn't just talk about poles, it uses polarization in a negative sense of the kind of sense you have for political polarization. People just don't get along with each other. People are divided into two camps. And it's sort of imagining the same thing happening in the whole international society that appears to be happening in some Western societies of increasing political polarization. It also it gets, I think, probably in a bit of a muddle about whether or not the world is multipolar. It wants to introduce this concept of multipolarization. And it says, well, it's a little bit multipolar, it's a little bit unipolar, it's a little bit bipolar, it's a little bit multipolar, it's a little bit zero polar. So I think in the end it becomes a little bit confusing about what the report is really saying, which is perhaps not surprising for a report like this, which is presenting opinions for opinion leaders at a major diplomatic conference like the Munich Security Conference. But it does propose this idea of multipolarization, which I'll come back to towards the end, and also this idea of depolarization, which I think is good because it's sort of recognizing the world is changing through processes, but I think it perhaps doesn't really fully grasp the nature of those processes. And overall, the tone of the report is, genuine, intelligent, engaged, open discussion about some of these changes, obviously very much from a Atlanticist point of view. I guess both the two principal authors that I mentioned are based in Germany, but with very strong affiliations to the various NATO-type organisations in Germany. And also the report is, well, given it's been released, and I think the Vice President of the United States attending the Munich Security Conference, it's remarkably critical of Donald Trump and his political directions. Okay, let's go a little bit more into what the report says. So in the report, it amplifies on this idea that multipolarity is not just about a changed distribution of the power in the world, it's about a polarization of the states of the world so that they cannot resolve conflicts. And it says visions of multipolarity are thus also polarised. This makes it increasingly difficult to adapt the existing order peacefully, avoid new arms races, prevent violent conflicts within and among states, allow for more inclusive economic growth, and jointly address shared threats like climate change, which respondents to the Munich Security Index have consistently rated highly. As the great and not so great powers cannot tackle these challenges alone, their cooperation will be crucial. That many in the international community still value rules-based multilateralism was evident in last year's adoption of the Pact for the Future. That was the document that was adopted at the UN Summit for the Future, which, however, there was significant criticism of from some governments around the world as largely reflecting sort of G7 interests. But for this cooperation to materialise, the world could well use some depolarisation. 2025 will show whether this is in the cards or whether the world will grow yet more divided than it is. And again, so this is the key points of their whole argument around multipolarisation happening and a depolarisation being perhaps an antidote to multipolarity, multipolarity is seen in a negative sense as division rather than a positive sense of broader distribution of power. Although they summarise their key points as saying it's unclear whether we are already living in a truly multipolar system. Today's world is characterised by multipolarization. While the world today displays elements of uni, bi, multi or even non-polarity, really quite a conceptual muddle there, it is clearly being shaped by a changing global distribution of power, with a large number of actors having the ability to influence key global issues. But the world is also experiencing increasing polarisation, both at the international level and within many countries' domestic politics. For many politicians and citizens around the globe, a more multipolar world holds significant promise, but increasing competition among various poles and their order models is already impeding joint approaches to global crises and threats. As few states still pursue foreign policies focused on the common good, I wonder who the few states that are doing it. I know India explicitly says it pursues the national interest and the global good. Clearly, that's not the policy that Marco Rubio espouses. He explicitly espouses a view that the sole purpose of US foreign policy is to serve US national interests and not the national common good. But that's a bit of a digression. As few states still pursue foreign policies focused on the common good and domestic divides are further complicating such attempts, it is far from clear how a process of depolarization could set multipolarity on a positive track, could be initiated. So there really is there, and I've said as my little sort of summary of that, there's a sense in which they feel the people of the world, both in the I guess those the global South countries angrily challenging Western leadership, and the domestic revolts within Western societies challenging the capacity of the political leadership, the current political leaders of those countries, to conduct diplomacy in the way the authors of the report would like them to do. There is a sense in which governments need to elect a new people, to paraphrase or to adapt Bertolt Brecht's famous line. And there really is quite a fear of polarisation that comes through in this report. Let me show that to you. So they say what the unipolar moment was to the distribution of power, the liberal moment was to the realm of ideas. And if you've been reading my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, you'd know the unipolar moment was an illusion. And I think the liberal moment is another piece of conjuring illusion going on here in the realm of ideas. Following the oft-quoted end of history, assuming that it actually happened, Western interpretations of democracy and market economy seemed set to conquer the world. Wow. Conquer the world. They're pretty loose in their language there. But this ideational unipolarity is gone. While liberal ideas remain attractive to people around the world, they have become increasingly contested both from within and without. And then they evoke the Russia-led anti-Western coalition. Moreover, skeptics have reason to question whether the consolidation of geopolitical blocs will survive the rise of liberal populists in liberal democracies, who often demonstrate close ideological affinities with autocratic foreign governments. Rather, polarisation and an illiberal nationalist backlash could undermine the idea of a cohesive West and reinvigorate debates about Westlessness. All this suggests a neat two-block world looks unlikely. They are very much there articulating the almost Spenglerian sort of anxiety about the fall of the liberal West. And I think it's perhaps a telltale sign about the biases of this report. I don't think it's actually a credible analysis of the sort of cultural sentiment around the world, but that's for a discussion for another day. So what they pose against this risky, dangerous, multipolarization is what they call depolarization. So they say any effort to reform the existing order in a way that reflects greater multipolarity but still serves the international community at large, whoever that is, will depend on the major powers, whoever they are, presumably the major powers attending the Munich Security Conference, defining their own interests broadly and with a view to the long term in a way that could be called enlightened. Yet few of the old and new powers are doing so, and some of those who still define their interests more broadly, among them European states and Japan, are desperately clinging to the hope that the status quo can be maintained. As such, they risk becoming defenders of last resort for the world of yesterday. And while the US might once have felt a special responsibility to shape a liberal order that benefits the wider world, critics fear that under President Trump's leadership, it might behave in the same narrowly self-interested, frequently exploitative way as many great powers throughout history. And notwithstanding what many people have said about Marco Rubio being a return to realism and multipolarity in that same interview, he very much articulated the view that the sole purpose of US foreign policy was to serve US national interests. So there may well be a justified fear there. But their evocation of this sort of enlightened depolarization is, I think, in a way, a background reinstatement of the sort of dominance of the West, of the liberal universalism that the West has grown accustomed to really since, the 1830s, as I trace in my videos on the rise and fall of global empires. So there is certainly a lot of, ideological interpretation, certainly a lot of questionable stuff in this report. Nonetheless, I do think it's a very interesting engagement with the issue. And what is also interesting is the Munich Security Index, the various data that they produce about opinion across the 11 countries they surveyed, of perceptions of risk and perceptions of who is a great power in the world. Survey, and there's some of the methodology there. They basically surveyed 1,000 people in 11 countries, and you can pause the video and read the detail of the methodology if you want. But what that survey did was really ask people about relative strengths of different powers and also the perceptions of security risks across the world. And I don't want to go into all the detail of that, but I do want to highlight some things about it that suggest that people around the world have very different perceptions of how the world is going to shake out over the next few years. And I do also think it is not insignificant that an institution like the Munich Security Conference is being effectively briefed by its experts to accept the reality that there are many powers in the world these days, and they can't all just work it out in the US White House Situation Room, let alone the G7 conference. And I do encourage people to go and have a look at the report and to explore some of these detailed tables. So, for example, here they have a index which shows the 11 countries that I think that they look at, or the 8 countries that they look at. I think it's they've broken up the EU into France, Germany, and Italy, I think, as well. But they look at multiple sources of power and multiple measures. So you get a sense, and the sort of darkly purpley colours are sort of high ratings. The light blue are low ratings. So you actually get a sense in this. So they look at a range of different sources of power and multiple measures of power. And if you're familiar with my work over at jeffrich.substack.com, you might be aware that I've been arguing for some time that there are, 5 world states, great powers, if you like, around the world today: the United States, China, Russia, India, and the European Union. And there are other groupings of states that also have significant initiative and influence around the world as well. But all of those 5 states all rank very highly on one or other source of power. And again, power doesn't just come from the barrel of a gun. It doesn't just come from having lots of money. There are multiple sources of power: population, territory, the resources, the real, not just the economy as such, but the resources that the economy mobilises, military power, cultural power, diplomatic power as well. And so again, this theme comes through in this multipolarization report, which I think is a very good thing. Then one of the most intriguing things I think about the report was this little survey about respondents' perspectives on which countries are great powers. This was a survey done in November 2024, saying which respective country is a great power. And once you go sort of purple, you're above 50%. If you're blue, you're below 50%. So you can see that for most countries, there are at least 3, if not 4, 5, 6, or even 7 states that the majority of people in their countries regard as a great power. And the thing about power is, people have debated what the nature of power really is for centuries, but it is something which to some degree, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. It has a reality behind it as well, but if someone is perceived as powerful to some degree, they become powerful. So I think that's a really interesting thing to explore. And again, on my Substack at jeffrich.substack throughout the year, I'm doing a world history tour of 5 world powers, those 5 powers that I mentioned before, exploring exactly these things and recasting some of our own perceptions and historical narratives of those great powers. Then there is also a lot of interesting material here in the report about perceptions of security risks. And then again, I do encourage you to go and get the report. I showed the earlier on in the video where you can get the report, and I'll include a link to that in the video description below. But you can see in this table, without looking too much of the detail, what I'd probably focus on is the very bottom line is China. And across pretty much all of those risks, China has a much, much lower rating of risk than other parts of the world. And indeed, so does India as well. And to some degree, the countries that are most concerned about risk are the countries in Europe: Italy, Brazil, Germany, with the United Kingdom and the United States being a little bit in between there. Of course, the United States does not rate rising inequality as highly as most other countries in the world. And there are a whole lot of other sorts of issues there. So, of course, this kind of survey is really, I mean, it's just an opinion survey of 1,000 people, which is not really a huge in each of these countries. So it's not a particularly large sample. It's not a particularly robust methodology in many ways. But I guess it also perhaps points to maybe a gap in, let's call it the paranoia gap between the Western countries and the global South, and perhaps the higher perception of risk in some of the Western countries is also creating its own problems. And you can see that specifically here with this side-by-side comparison of the of China and the United States. Now, you're going to have to probably pause the video and look at that in more detail, but the two different risks highlighted, the top security concerns highlighted in the two countries of China and the United States. Well, first of all, you just look at the different colours there. A lot more perception of risk in the United States than there is in China. Obviously, there may well be survey issues in that. But the top security concern in the United States, of all things, all things that could go wrong in the world, their top concern is cyber attacks. In China, perhaps more soberly, the top security concern is the United States, and yet, whereas in the United States, 68% feel cyber attacks on the US are imminent. In China, only 7% of respondents feel unprepared for the risk posed by the US government. So in terms of my overall assessment of this report, I mean, I've looked at what it broadly says, who the authors are, the good things about it, sort of openly discussing these issues of multipolarization, very much within a US Atlanticist international relations theory sort of framework, but nonetheless openly discussing it. I talk about its sort of negative casting of multipolarity and this whole idea of depolarization. I don't think it really resolves the debate about whether we're in the multipolar world. Even within supporters of the idea of the multipolar world, there is a debate around the term of whether or not it is a multipolar world, or whether it's what Pepe Escobar and Chaz Freeman have taken to calling it multinodal world. My perspective, for what it's worth, is I'm with Dr. S.J. Shankar, the Indian External Affairs Minister, who wrote in the India Way that the natural state of the world is multipolarity. Another way of putting that is the natural state of the world is plurality. Plurality, we are all different. There are multiple people who have their own sense of agency all around the world. And in a way, the world has always been multipolar in a sense of it has always been plural, and it has always resisted the attempt of world powers, of world conquerors, of global strategists, of global hegemons to impose a single rule, to impose a single set of rules, even if it is this sort of universalist idea of the liberal rules-based order. The universalist idea of the progressive, Western civilization. So I don't think proposing the term multipolarization and depolarization actually provides a terribly better response to that sort of discussion. But I do think it is a worthwhile contribution to the discussion. But it does very much, I think, reintroduce, I guess, that liberal universalist idea of Western civilization, of the enlightened liberal West telling the rest of the world the way they should behave through the back door. So towards the end of their discussion of multipolarization, they say, furthermore, a multipolar world may also undermine universal rules and norms. Well, I guess that's almost logically true, because if we accept that a multipolar world is in fact a plural world, then it is a contradiction of universal rules and norms. We have different rules and norms and objectives and purposes and interests that we need to talk about rather than project out onto the world. As the former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell, has argued, maybe before or after, he referred to the rest of the world as a jungle, I'm not sure. When the number of participants in a game increases, the natural response should be to strengthen the rules governing the game, assuming, of course, you are the person who decides the rules governing the game. There's an interesting assumption in Joseph Borrell's comment. But rather than strengthening international law, multipolarization may well move us away from an order that does have standards, even if they are sometimes implemented inconsistently. They concede, let's not get into all the details of that, and towards an order without any standards at all. Evidence of this can be found in the revisionist approach to international rules adopted by some of the new poles of influence and the lack of pushback against this norm, contestation from others. Okay, so this is really where I think this is where I guess the truth about this report really comes out. It's absolutely worth a read. I think it's absolutely got some interesting data about perceptions of risk and the perceptions of power around the world. But it still is not really coming to terms with because it's trapped in the sort of international relations theory discourse and in the assumption of Western dominance, liberal Western dominance. It's still not really coming to terms with the fundamental historical processes that are going on that are changing not just the distribution of power around the world, but the distribution of resources and wealth and cultural dynamism and new ideas around the world. In other discussions, I've referred to this as the tides of globalization, that globalization is no longer Westernization. And I think this Munich Security Dialogue report is really a insecure sort of defensive response to these changes rather than a real coming to terms with it. And similarly, I think Marco Rubio's statement that, we don't want to be a global policeman, of course it's a multipolar world, is really just a continuation of the American tradition of prioritizing its national interests beyond any other universal or any other global norm. Refusal to recognize genuine negotiation with others. It's not really a recognition of a changed world. But rather the long resistance within the United States to what they call world government, e.g. the United Nations, or indeed international law, which has, Jeffrey Sachs and many others have commonly pointed out the United States consistently breaches. So if you're interested in a deeper look at the real history of the multipolar world, and I should add that this multipolarization report has some pretty standard tropes about the history of the post-1945 world that don't really stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't really refer much to history at all. It just refers largely to the sort of international relations scholars from the US for its security point of view. But if you're interested in a deeper look at how history really is reshaping the world we live in, and you want to live in tune with the mode of that changing world, you can go over to, my YouTube channel, where for a start at the moment I'm doing an entire series on the rise and fall of global empires, which will give you a much better account of the real history that's behind all of that. But you can also sign up for my world history tour of world powers, where I'm looking at the real quality history books, weekly history book recommendations on all of these major powers this year: USA, China, India, Europe, Russia, and ultimately I will be extending it to some of the other places in the world like Southeast Asia and Africa, who also have significant resources, the power of the powerless. And you can get my weekly book recommendations, deep dives and slow reads at jeffrich.substack.com. You can join for free, but you can also get a whole lot more by becoming a paid subscriber for $5 US a month or $50 US a year. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again soon.